Hello, in today's video we're going to extend our inventory just a little bit more by allowing the user to drag and drop. Hi, my name is Michael. Welcome to my 2D action and adventure RPG tutorial series. Follow along and learn how to create your own AARPG in Godot 4 using GDScript. Alright everybody, so here's what we're going to do. With this one, we're going to just be building off of our existing inventory. And in order to create the drag and drop functionality, I'm doing my best to fit it in with the kind of the nodes and the scenes that we've built previously in the tutorial series. And so if you're a newcomer and you're just kind of jumping in, out of order, this may not provide all of the answers that you need. So you might want to go back and look at some of the other videos to see how we built this UI. But some of the general things we'll cover will be beneficial to just about anybody following along. But what we're going to do is we're going to take our inventory slot UI, right, which is the little UI that displays an inventory slot item. We use it on our character and our equipment when we pause. And we're going to add a basic dragging state to this as well as a visual so that while you're dragging, as you can see in this little example, you'll see like a faded version of the texture of that item. And then we're also going to kind of just clean up and improve the drag and the use functionality of these items based on some basic distance to see how far you've dragged the mouse. But obviously, we just have to be careful that, these items can be used by clicking on them. At least some of them can, or maybe even equipped. And so we want to make sure that it's not too kludgy and giving the user mixed signals on how to drag and drop and maybe accidentally using or consuming an item when they didn't mean to. And, we'll do some work there. And then the next step after that will be kind of working on the pause menu. Now we're going to be adding the drag to the inventory slot UI item, but the actual drop functionality will be handled by the inventory UI nodes, which are in our pause menu. We'll go ahead and go in there and we will connect some of the signals from our slot inventory UI into this. And so we'll handle things like mousing over of other items while we are dragging, as well as what happens when the user releases the mouse button or drops that dragged item. Okay, we'll handle all that from the inventory UI itself. And then lastly, we're going to go into our InventoryData resource class, and we're going to just add one new simple method that will allow us to swap items in the inventory based on their index and use that to kind of complete the whole feature. All right. No new assets required for this. If you're new and want to see where we got all this stuff, you can look for the itch.io page linked in the description and you'll find a whole ton of assets there. And of course, you can look back at the series and just see where we've been and see how we got to this UI to begin with. And so I guess without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we are. I'm looking at my pause menu inventory screen, right? This control node, it's in a canvas layer. And this is where we're going to be doing our work. And of course, if you look at our grid container that contains all of our inventory slots, each of these inherits a different scene. Let's go ahead and open this scene. It's the inventory slot, and it's got this script attached that's called the inventory slot UI. So if we drag it up to the top, okay. So these are some of the basic components that we're going to work with as we get started on this new feature. But going back real quick to our pause menu. So we're going to be able to handle the dragging effect on a per slot item basis, as we mentioned. So that's where we will get started. And so I want to just come in here. Let's look at this inventory slot UI. It's a button, right? And if we look at our script, it extends a button. So the base control node type is a button. But inside that button, we are using a custom texture rect to display the image that goes along with our inventory, as well as a label that shows the count of how many of that inventory item we have. And we've already got a lot of code hooked up within our pause menu, right? Like if we look at this grid container that houses all of our inventory item and look at the script here, this script itself handles a lot of the inventory UI functionality. Okay, so we'll be able to leverage this script as well. Items. But going back to this inventory slot then, right, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of create a duplicate of this texture and allow it to drag with the mouse. Obviously, the main one's going to stay centered here. So that's one thing that our script will handle. And we'll use that to get the visual effect. And again, essentially, this inventory slot UI is going to be responsible for knowing when it's being dragged and doing some stuff with that. But we're not actually going to drag the whole UI itself, that button. Okay, that's going to stay in place. And so let's go ahead and begin. We're going to be doing most of our work within the scripts then, since we've already got these scenes and nodes set up. So just looking at this script, we need some extra variables and some new functions. And so let's start by declaring these new variables. And first, we're going to add a couple things that are going to help us know if we're currently in the dragging state, as well as some other things that we want to be able to do or keep track of while we're controlling that state, like this new texture that we're going to be dragging around. We want to keep a reference to that. And we want a value to know like where we started our drag and things like that, right? So let's just go ahead and let's just get into these. So first new variable will be called click position, and just maybe POS for short. And we'll go ahead and just set that to vector2, 0 to begin with. And then next, let's go ahead, we'll set up 3 variables that we're going to use for the dragging. So we'll have one that's a Boolean, we'll just call it dragging. And by default, we'll set this to false. We'll also have a variable to know what the texture is that we're dragging. So we'll call this drag texture. And this can be of just type control. It's actually going to be probably just this texture rectangle duplicated, but we only need to be able to move it. So we only need to be able to manipulate the control aspect of it. So control is fine. And then lastly, we just want a drag threshold, okay? And what this drag threshold will be used for is for us to determine if we've dragged the item far enough that we know the user was trying to drag it, right? Because maybe they click and they only move the mouse like 1 or 2 pixels, and in which case we're going to ignore the drag. Okay, so drag threshold, and this will be a float. And think of this as a distance. Okay, and I'm going to set mine to about 16, so this will be roughly 16 pixels. And there we go, some new variables that we need at the beginning of our script. Now, the next piece is we're going to go to our ready function, and we need to connect to some new signals on our button. Okay, so we currently have connected to our focus entered and focus exited, as well as the pressed signal. And this is actually kind of important. Looking at our pressed, our button, the press behavior, the action mode is set to button release, which means the button doesn't count as pressed until the click is released, right? That's important because if we do it on button press, then it's not going to work very well with this particular implementation that I'm doing. Okay, so make sure you have it set up that way. And if it's set to button press, then you might be able to work around it, but I'm not going to cover that in this video. So the 2 new signals that we want to connect to are button down and button up. Now you'll notice that that sounds a lot like button pressed, right? A press consists of a button down and a button up. Okay, so button underscore down dot connect. And we'll go ahead and create some new functions for this. So we'll just call this one on button down. And then I'm going to go ahead and just copy this and change this to be button up. Okay. But these are signals that come from the button class that we're extending. Okay. So we just need to create these functions to get rid of these warnings. So I'm going to come down here just to the bottom of the script. And here we go. Make a new function for on button down. And then another one for on button up. So let's go ahead and just put a print statement in these and make sure that these 2 functions are working. So first on button down, we'll just print whatever on button down, right? I don't know. And then we'll print on button up on the other one. And then if we run the project, I'm going to go ahead and go over to scene 2 here and just run that scene. Now what we should see, even though my inventory is empty, these empty slots are still an instance of the InventorySlotUI. So if I click, you can see on button down, then when I release the mouse button, on button up. Now that on button up constitutes a press as well, okay? So if this were an item, it would try and use it or equip it. But now if I click and drag off, so you see how I clicked on that button. If I drag down here to this one below it, and the nice thing about buttons, by the way, they've got this hover, so I can already see which one I'm hovering because it's built into that functionality. When I let go on this, it said on button up, but that would not constitute a click on this button, okay? Because that's just kind of how it works. If the button release, if you've drug the mouse off the button, it won't do a button press. So that's going to help a little bit with our drag and drop functionality, because if it's a usable item, right, and we drag and drop it, it's not going to try and use like if that was an apple, but we'll see that in a little bit. So let's go ahead and let's work on this on button down. Now, what are the things that we need to do with on button down? We're going to want to take some of those variables that we have and we're going to want to set them and set the values. So the first one that we could set would be the click position. If you recall, we created that new variable. And all we need to do for this is we'll just get the global mouse position. So there's a function to do that. Get global mouse position. Simple as that. Okay, so that's just going to essentially record where the mouse was when we started the click. And then next, we're going to set our dragging variable equal to true. And then the next step is going to be a couple things. We want to get a copy of the texture on our button. So if you look at our inventory slot, this texture rectangle, we want to get a copy of it that we can then use and have it follow the mouse. Okay, so let's go back to our script. And it's not too hard to get. You should already have, if you're following along with the tutorials, you should already have an onReady variable that's referencing that texture rect, right? So we can just reference that in our code down here. So I'm just going to say drag texture. That's what we're trying to set, right? Equals, and then we're going to take our texture rect, and we're going to call this function called duplicate. And what this does is it just makes a copy of that node, all right? So that's pretty straightforward, I think. And then we also want to add this as a child. So I'm just going to say add child, and we'll say drag texture, okay? And so now we've created a copy of our texture rectangle. It's called drag texture. And let's go ahead and make it so that we can tell that we've done this. And I'm just going to say maybe drag. I'm just going to modulate it. We're going to remove this, but just as an example, we'll say drag texture dot modulate, and then I'll just pick red maybe. Color dot red. Okay, so let's go ahead and run the game again. So now when let's go ahead and pick up some items. I'm going to need some items. I've just got one. Okay, you can see that it created that red texture. And because this is an equipment, I can equip it. And it's getting kind of goofy because it's making lots of copies. But we know that that texture is being duplicated and created because we can see it. Okay, so that's a good valid test. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of this modulate. And so that we can test this a little bit more easily, real quick before we go on to the next step, I'm just going to drop a couple item drops in my scene so that I have those to work with. Or I guess they're called item pickups. Okay, so I've just gone ahead and instantiated a couple of these: gem, apple potion, and a stone. Okay. Let's go back to our script. So now we'll be able to pick those up. It'll make testing a little bit easier. Now looking at this script, obviously we want the drag texture to follow the mouse. And how are we going to do that? And currently we don't have a great way to do that here, but what I'm going to do is we will go ahead and create within our script. Let's go ahead and add the process function, okay? And because we're probably not going to use the delta on this, I'm going to give it an underscore just so we don't get that warning in the debugger that we have an unused variable. Okay. The process function is going to be pretty straightforward. All we're going to really do is just take that texture and move it around, but we only want to do it if we're dragging, right? So we'll say if dragging equals true, or you could just say if dragging, that would also work. Then in here, we're going to go ahead and do our functionality. First, we'll get our drag texture, right? Because we went ahead and set that. And then we're just going to set the position of this texture. And we're going to set it equal to, and we'll say get mouse, and we want to use get local mouse position. Okay, so that it's in relation to this node. I think that should be good enough for us to go ahead and test. So let's test this out. So if I look in here, all right, you can see that apple. Now, I've got an issue. The apple's like behind the other buttons. I wasn't quite expecting that, but there you go. And as I click and drag more things, you can see that they're kind of getting attached. So we've got some issues there, but I mean, you know, a little step forward, a little step back, okay? So let's go ahead and let's deal with a couple of these issues. First, let's deal with the fact that that texture was kind of behind the other buttons. So let's see, on button down right here. After we get this drag texture and we've created it, we've made it right, we've created a duplicate of the texture rectangle and assigned it to the drag texture. Let's go ahead and just adjust the Z index here. And we can just, I'm going to just set it to 10. It probably only needs to be something like 1, but that way it'll be higher than the other objects in the node. And then I also want to do one other thing here. I want to come down to our on button up. And instead of printing this line, let's go ahead and get rid of that drag texture, right? And we can also stop the dragging state by just setting dragging equal to false. Okay, because obviously once the button is up, that means we've released, we're done dragging. And then we'll just say if drag texture, then drag texture dot free. And there we go. Okay. So let's run one more time and just see what changes this made to the functionality. Go ahead and grab my items real quick. Okay. So now if I drag the apple, it's above everything, which is nice. And if I let go, it disappears. Okay. Now, one other thing that I'm not loving, two things. Let's adjust the visual of this dragged item. One, I would like it to stick underneath the cursor, although if you wanted it at the bottom right like this, that's okay too, but I'm going to stick it under the cursor. And then I also want to fade it so that it's kind of got an opacity and, you know, kind of obvious that this is the one I'm dragging. If I go to my script here, and if we go up to our process function, there it is. Whoop, 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 whoop. What we can do is within this if statement, if we're dragging, first I'm just going to modulate this drag texture. And the reason I'm doing it in process is very specific. We could modulate it in the item pressed function, right? And then because we just have to set it once. So, but I'm going to do it here in the process for a specific reason that will become obvious in just a second. But let's first modulate. I just want to modulate the alpha value. So I can say drag texture.modulate.a equals, and we'll pick 0.5. So now if I save this and come back to my game view, now when I click and drag, you can see that it's faded. Okay. Oops. I went ahead and used that apple. So that's what happens when you click and then release, right? Once you release that key, then it uses it if it's on top of the button. But one thing I don't like is I don't want to be dragging as soon as I click, because maybe I am just clicking just to use, and that little flash would be kind of hokey or goofy looking to me. So let's go back to our script, and I'm going to do a little check here. And I want to determine if we have moved our mouse outside of the drag threshold. And then if we have, right, or if you haven't left that threshold, then its alpha will be 0. If you have left the threshold, then we'll set the alpha to 0.5. So you'll only see the little hover texture once you've moved the mouse. But in order to do that, let's create one more new function right now. And we'll use this a couple times, and we'll just call it get drag distance. Actually, let's not call it get drag distance. We'll just call it like outside drag threshold maybe. Okay, so we'll say function outside drag threshold, and this will return a Boolean, right? Because we're asking it a question. I'm going to go ahead and just say return false, and then we'll maybe code up the true condition in here. So what we can do is we can say if, and then we'll say get underscore global mouse position dot distance to, and then we can say click position, right? Because that, if you recall the click position, when we set it based off of the global mouse position. And so we'll compare it to the global mouse position here. Okay, so this is going to give us a number. If this distance is greater than our drag threshold, then we can return true. Otherwise, we will return false. Okay, so I'm just going to copy this little function here, and let's go up and we'll do our check. And we'll say if outside drag threshold equals true, then we can set the texture alpha to 0.5. Else, we'll set that drag texture modulate to 0. So if I save this change and come back to the game, now you can see when the mouse is staying close in here, I don't see the drag texture, but then once I go outside, I can. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to do is I said I want to center this. Let's go ahead and just go back to our script. So this is maybe an optional little mini step for those of you following along. But where I'm setting the position here, I just need to subtract half of the size of this texture. Like if we look at our inventory slot, we can see that the texture rectangle has a size of 32 by 32 pixels. So I can just say minus vector 2, and I'll just say 16, 16. Okay. Save that one more time, go back to game, and there. Now, as I'm dragging, the item is underneath my cursor. Okay. Now, I think we're pretty much done except one last thing, and that's the press. So let's go ahead and I'm going to stop and I'm going to run this again. So what I would like to do is if I go to my inventory, so like this apple, for example, if I click and drag out here, it doesn't use the apple. But let's say I click right now where I haven't moved far enough to see the drag, I think it would be fine to use it. But maybe once I go up here and release, maybe I shouldn't let it consume the apple, right? And so let's go to our script. And what we can say is, let's find our item pressed function in here. Let's see, where are we? So InventorySlotUI, item pressed. So within this, once the item's pressed, if we've got a slot data, yada, 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 we go through and we use the item, right? And I think all we need to do is we can just check first, or maybe right in here with if slot data, and we have that new function that we made, right? That's called outside drag threshold. So if this equals false, right? So we have to have a slot data and we have to be within that drag threshold. So now if I save that change and come back to the game, so now like right here, I am not outside the drag threshold, so it would use the item. But once I'm right here, even though I'm still hovering the button, I'm outside the drag threshold, so I see that drag icon. So that the user is not confused, they don't want to use the item. And let's see what happens when I let go. There we go, it worked. But now if I come over here and then I'm like, wait, no, I just want to use that and let go, then it will consume the item, okay? So that concludes what we need to add for right now to our inventory slot UI. So hopefully you've got yours working like that. And then the next step, we'll move on to our inventory UI. Okay, so I'm going to just open the inventory UI. And again, this is the script that we've got applied within our pause menu. It's attached to this grid container that handles, this inventory. And if we look at the script, what it does is it keeps track of our slots. It obviously knows to update it when the pause menu is shown or hidden, etc. It can clear the inventory and it updates the inventory. Now, an important note, if you've been following along with this series, we did make some somewhat significant changes and improvements to this, and it really affected the update inventory function, as well as a few other things within this script. So you may want to go back to that video, which would have been part of the equipment series, and then just look at that. But otherwise, if you've built this script previously, you should have something that looks similar if you haven't caught up to this at this point. All right. But what we want to do is in this script, we want to handle the conditions where our button is dropped, or not our button. I mean, it is our button, right? But our item, if we drop an item over top of another item, we want to handle a lot of that in here. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to track what other item we might be hovering at any given time to see if we've successfully dropped on top of something. So the first thing we'll do is let's just add an additional variable here. So this variable, I'll go ahead and call it hovered item. And it'll be of type InventorySlotUI, right? The script that we were just working on. And right now it's null, which is fine. And then what we're going to do is inside of this script, we need to connect to several signals on our InventorySlotUI. And not only that, but we have to be able to disconnect and reconnect to them if our inventory moves around so that we have references to the correct items. And so let me just come down here. Let's create a function for that first. And actually we can kind of plop into place where it's going to be. So when we look at our update inventory script, this is the one that's going to populate the data. And you can see right here, we're looping over the inventory slots, I should say. And then we're kind of setting the data of these. Now, this is where your code might look significantly different because in the original version, we actually created instances of the slot UI, but here we're just setting the data on them. But what I want to do is I want to connect to the signals here. And because there's multiple signals, I don't want to do it all right here. We'll make a new function and we'll just call it connect item signals. And because we want to connect signals to the signals on an item, we're going to have to pass in the item to this function, okay? And that item is referred to as the slot right here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and copy that and just come down to the bottom of my script and let's create this function. And obviously the slot, I'm going to go ahead and change this. We're going to call this, I'm just going to call item. And we know that this is a slot or inventory slot UI. And in here, we're going to do some checks. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to connect, we want to connect to our button up. We want to connect to when the mouse enters and exits this item, because that's how we know if it's over it or not. Okay. Okay, so when we connect to these signals, we'll start with the the button up. So we'll just say item, because this is a button, we have a button up, button down. Okay, the reason we want to listen to button up is because this is how we'll know if the user has tried to drop it. So we'll say item.buttonup.connect, and we'll have to make a function for this, and we'll call it onItemDrop. Okay. That function doesn't exist, so let's go ahead and create that. Now we want this item drop button. We want to be able to tell it which button or, which item we dropped. So we'll pass in that item. And then in order to be able to pass in an argument on a signal connection like this, we had to use this .bind function, bind, and then here we'll just pass in the item. Okay, so this item will get passed in right here. And then likewise, we want to connect to, so let's see, we have mouse entered. And we'll go ahead and call this on item mouse entered, okay? And we'll go ahead and do the same thing here. We'll bind the item. And then we'll create this function down below. And give it the same argument of an item, okay? And then we'll have one more. We'll say item.mouse exited. And we'll connect this to a new signal that we'll call onItemMouseExited. There, and then for this one, we don't need to pass in the item. I'm just going to go ahead and create that function. And there we go. Now, one thing that we need to do with each of these, though, is because this update inventory gets called on a continual basis, if we have already connected to this signal and we try and connect again, then we're going to get some issues. And we don't really want those errors to pop up, so we'll just do a simple check. And there is, of course, a function that checks to see if a signal has already been connected to this function, or by the node to the function. So we can say if not item dot button up. Is that the first one? Yeah, button up dot is connected, and then we just have to say what the signal is that we're looking at here. So on item drop. There, if it's not connected, we'll connect. And we'll just do the same thing for the rest of these, right? For mouse entered, we'll check if it's connected to the on item mouse entered, and so on. Okay, so now that we've got these checks in place, we know we're not going to try and connect where we can't. And we're good to go with that, okay? So we have this connect item signals. Let's double check that we implemented this properly. So our update inventory in this for loop, yeah, connect item signals, and it's passing in the slot. So we should be good to go there. Now, in order for us to know if this is working, let's just go ahead and let's add some print statements so that we can test real quick. So on item drop, item dropped is what we'll say. And I'll go ahead and just maybe plug in the name of the item, item.name. And then likewise, when we hover or exit, we'll say item hovered. And actually this last one, we cannot use the item name because we don't have a reference to it here, right? I'll just say exited. Okay, so now if we run, let's see, let's go ahead and save this. I'm gonna go ahead and run the scene that I test in. Okay. So now what we should see, we've got some item hovered, item exited, and you can see it's giving us the slot name. And when I drop this, it should say item dropped, inventory slot 4. Okay, so we're getting those signals. Those are working just fine. Let's go back to our script. And let's just go ahead and deal with these on item hovered. Okay, so instead of printing the hovered item, instead what we want to do is, we created that variable where we can keep track of this. So let's just go ahead and update that variable. And what did we call it? Hovered item? Yeah, hovered item equals item. Odom. Item. Okay. And then down here where it's been exited, we can just say hovered item equals null. That's all we need for that. Okay. Simple as that. And then up here on item drop, what we're going to do is we can just check if we should drop the item. Like if we were hovering over, if we had a hovered item, as opposed to a null hovered item, then we know we can drop and we need to swap it. Because even an empty slot should give us something to work with here, okay? Because even though the item might be empty and some of the slot data might be null, it's still going to have an inventory slot. It's just not going to have an item in it, okay? So I guess that name, I'm using it a little bit too interchangeably, but hopefully that makes sense. So even if we hover and drop over an empty slot, we should still be able to swap items, okay? So this will allow you to reorganize even empty spaces in your inventory. Okay, so we can do a check, and if it's a valid target, we can swap it, and if not, we can just do nothing. And so what we'll do is we'll just say, let's put the conditions in here, right? The first condition where we would not want to drop the item is if the item is null for some reason, which is unlikely to happen, or if the item is the item we've just been dragging. So if item equals hovered item, right? That's another case where we don't need to do anything. Like we just dropped the item on its original slot. That's fine. Or one last condition is if the hovered item, if there's no hovered item, if this is null, okay, then what we can do, and we'll go ahead and we'll do our print. We'll go ahead and print a message here that just says don't drop. And we can just return the function, okay? Otherwise, we'll do the item drop. And so if we just test this out, we should see two different messages depending on the conditions. So if we go back to the game, so like right now, if I were to drag this gem down, you can see it said item dropped. But if I drag it out here, it says don't drop. Or if I drag it on top of itself, it says don't drop, okay? And even if I come over here to these item slots, it's not going to work because we haven't hooked these up. And for now, I think that's okay because we'd have to get into more logic to be able to detect types and make sure that we want to drag and drop into these slots when you can just click. I mean, here, let's go ahead, right? If you want to figure out how to implement the drag and drop to these, you can, but a click works just fine because it can only go in one slot. So for what it's worth, that's what we'll do there. I wonder if you guys can hear that helicopter. It's pretty dang loud out there. Okay, so we've kind of gone ahead and finished actually most of the drag and drop because the last bit of magic that's going to happen is going to happen within our InventoryData resource class. Okay, so I'm back here. Now, before we finish this up, let me just take these little print statements, at least this one here. I'm not going to print that. And we don't really need to print this print statement either. We'll obviously need to finish this. Okay, but let's go, and if we look at this InventoryUI, you should have an InventoryData resource already referenced. I'm just going to open up the script. Now, this script is pretty big because it does a lot of work and a lot of lifting, but we're going to add one function that's quite straightforward and use that in here. And so we'll come down probably somewhere around where we use an item. Let me just click, where's use item? Okay, so maybe like right between use and equip item, maybe after equip item, I don't know. Actually, no, these are all related to equip item. Let me put it right here. I'm going to make a new function, and of course, where it goes is only important for organizational purposes. But we'll call this swap items by index. Now, we need the indexes of the items we want to swap, right? Because we said items, plural. So I'm just going to have two indexes. I'll call them I1, which is an integer, and I2. Okay. And then what we're going to do in this function is we're going to grab the item from slot 1, and then we're going to put item from slot 2 into that slot 1, and then we'll put this item 1 that we already pulled out and stick it into slot 2, just like that. Does that make sense? So we'll call this first item that we pull out the temp. Okay. And this is of type slot data. That's what we're working with within our inventory, right? We're going to look at our slots. Let's just review that briefly. Okay. We're going to be working on these slots, which is an array of slot data. Okay. So the temp item is going to equal, and we're going to look at slots at I1. Okay. So we're going to grab the item right here. Right. This way, because we've grabbed it, now we can go to slots at I1 and we can set that equal to a new item, and it doesn't matter, okay? So we'll just call that slots at I2, just like that. And then finally, we can go to slots at I2, and this will equal the temp. Okay, so we've just done a little switcheroo. Pull the guy out, put something in his place, and then stuck the one we pulled out in the place of the guy that we pulled right here, okay? Simple function. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to come back to my InventoryUI, and down where we have our item drop, right here where we said we're going to connect to the data, I'm just going to say, and obviously I can't quite do this, right? I need to call my data.swap items by index, because if we look, right, that's what I have it called. Data is my inventory data. And then I need to get those indexes to pass them in. Fortunately for us, this is one thing I love about Godot, is so many things just work and make sense. But we've got two items. We've got our item and we've got our hovered item. And because these are referencing, if we look at our scene here, these are referencing items here, because they're in this tree in this fashion, they're each going to have an index. So this is going to be index 0. That's, you know, item here is index 1. And we're going to have index 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Okay. So if we go back to our script, really all we need to do is we just need to get our item dot, and then the function that we want is called getIndex. Okay. And we can leave that argument blank. And then the next thing we want is our hovered item dot getIndex. Just like that. Okay. We'll get the indexes, and those are going to line up with our inventory because of the way we've designed this. There's a one-to-one relationship of how these are structured and how our inventory data is structured, okay? If for some reason your inventory data wasn't structured the same way, you know, with the same kind of list and order as your UI, then you might have an issue here. But if you're following along with this tutorial, then you should be good to go. I think we should have a working product. Let me just go ahead and let's give this a whirl. We'll go ahead and pick up some items. So now if I drag this, oh, it didn't work. Should be obvious actually why. If we go back to our script, we've swapped them, but we haven't updated the inventory. Let's call that function real quick. So it's called update inventory, and I'm going to set this value here to false because our update inventory is wondering if we want to apply focus, and we can just say, no, we don't need to do that. So if I save this and go back to the game, boink, that one moved funny, but I think that's because, uh-oh, something's going on here. I think it's because we were dragging stuff around before I had that finished and implemented. So let's stop and let's run the scene one more time. And hopefully this works, otherwise we might have a little bug in there. Okay, so now if I drag, I can drag anything. In fact, I can drag, huh. Oh, if I drag back, it's not working. We do have a bug, and I know exactly what the bug is. So if I drag forward a slot, you can see it's hovering, and it works. It will swap with another item. But as soon as I drag to a previous item, you notice how it's not giving me the hover effect. Like here, you can see that when I'm hovering over, it gets highlighted, and when I drag back, it's not. Anything after and anything before. Okay, so we do have, oops, one little bug in there. And here's what the bug is. If I look back at my script, I need to go into the InventorySlotUI. Because we're dragging this little texture, it's actually consuming and blocking the mouse input is what's happening. So let's just come in here where we do the, let's see, on button down. In our on button down, we create this texture. And what we need to do is we already gave it a Z index and added it as a child, but as I mentioned, it's consuming and it's kind of blocking that mouse input, okay? And the reason why it's only blocking mouse input to the ones previous is because if you look at, it's a child of the button. And when you look at how the buttons are stacked, if these weren't in a grid container, they would be stacked on top of each other with this first one on the bottom and this last one on top. So technically anything to the left or above one of these buttons is underneath it, right? And then all these are above it. So it's getting my mouse event here because these are above what I'm dragging, but these are below what I'm dragging, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So go back to our script. We'll say drag texture. And then the property that we want to set is our mouse filter. And then we just need to set this to, and it's part of control, control.mouseFilterIgnore. Okay. Now if I save that, go back to my game, there, now I can drag forward and back. Voila. And you know, the most beautiful thing about all of this is that because of the way we've built our inventory, I'm going to go ahead and drag this in a very specific configuration. I'm going to close my menu. I'm going to come back down here and I'm going to go over to System and Save. Okay. Now, if I stop and I run this game again, and I come up here and go to Load, there we go. You can see that the items are in the position where they are because we handled the saving of those in that InventoryData resource script. Okay, so that the save and load is just built in. We get that for free because I guess we did something right when we were building the inventory system, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm not that smart, but apparently I managed to get it to work. So if you guys learned something new or appreciated this video, please give me a like or drop a comment below. And of course, if you're new to the channel and want to see the next video that's coming out, make sure you subscribe because I'm putting out content on typically a weekly basis. Okay, so I'm working at it. And you can also join me on Patreon if you want access to some of the special content I give them. Every now and then I give them freebies and things like that and access to a special repository where I'm sharing some other projects I'm working on. And that's a growing resource, so I hope that those who are following along are getting their use from it. And of course, we've got a Discord community. That's awesome. You can join us there if you got questions and want to dig into the bugs or just meet other game developers who are learning alongside you. So it's really awesome. Please join if you want to keep learning. And as always, we'll see you guys next time.